How do you get something that looks incredibly complex, almost alive, from the simplest possible set of rules? Well, we're about to dive into a corner of science that shows us exactly how something can come from almost nothing. I mean, just look at this. It looks chaotic, it's intricate. It almost feels like it's growing. You'd think it was made by some super complex algorithm or maybe even an artist. But what if I told you that this entire world, every single change you see, is driven by just one incredibly simple instruction? And that's where the magic of something called a cellular automaton comes in. Picture a huge sheet of graph paper. Each little square or cell can be on or off, black or white. And with every tick of a clock, each cell just looks at its immediate neighbors and decides what it's going to do next, based on a single rule that everyone follows. That's it. Simple rules, local chatter, and you get these absolutely staggering results. Okay, so within this whole universe of automata, researchers started to wonder, what if we look at the absolute simplest case we can possibly imagine? They came up with something they affectionately call the lazy automaton. And as we're about to see, its laziness is exactly what makes it such an amazing thing to study. Right, if you want to understand where all this complexity comes from, you have to go back to basics. You have to find the simplest possible starting point. So researchers asked, what's the most stripped down, most elementary version of this system that we can build? So on one hand, you have your typical automata. They can have lots of rules for all sorts of different patterns. But the lazy automaton, it's the total opposite. It has exactly one job. It literally does nothing. It just copies the world from one moment to the next until it sees one very, very specific pattern. The entire system is programmed to react to just one single trigger, what the researchers call its unique active transition. If the automaton sees that specific pattern, it'll act. If it sees anything else in the entire universe, it does nothing. It is the absolute definition of minimal effort. So here's the big question. If a system only does one thing, what happens over time? Does it just do its thing and then fizzle out? Does it get stuck in a loop forever? Or could it somehow create infinite complexity? This is the central mystery researchers are trying to solve. What is the system's ultimate fate? In the language of this research, this whole idea is called the order of the automaton. You can kind of think of it as the system's entire playbook, its complete life cycle. It's the total number of unique worlds it can create before it either just stops or starts repeating itself. And it turns out, every one of these lazy automata has one of three possible destinies. First, it can have a finite order, which means it either evolves for a bit and then just stops, frozen forever, or it gets stuck in a repeating loop. Or option 3, it can have an infinite order, becoming this endless wellspring of novelty that just keeps churning out new patterns forever, without ever repeating. And this, right here, is where the whole lazy thing becomes so fascinating. Because the system is so incredibly simple, we can actually predict its entire future just by looking at its one and only rule. The researchers themselves put it perfectly. They said the behavior is simple, but the questions are subtle. Everything, and I mean everything, hinges on the choice of that one active pattern, P, and the new thing it writes, A. That single choice is literally the seed for the entire universe's future. Think about that for a second. The geometry, the literal shape of that one trigger pattern, holds the code for the system's entire destiny. The secret to whether it'll die out, loop, or create infinite complexity is written right there in its DNA from the very beginning. So, how does this actually work? Well, for a system to have a finite order, to eventually stop, its active pattern has to be kind of self-destructive. When the automaton sees the trigger and makes a change, that very change breaks the original pattern apart. And if that process doesn't accidentally create new triggers somewhere else, the whole chain reaction just fizzles out. The system literally runs out of things to do. But for infinite order, the exact opposite has to be true. The pattern has to be self-replicating. This time, when the rule is triggered, the change it makes actually helps to build a new copy of that same trigger pattern somewhere else on the grid. This kicks off a cascade, a chain reaction, that can keep itself going forever, constantly creating something new. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is some really cool math, but why does it matter in the big picture? Why are people spending so much time studying these deliberately simple, lazy little systems? Well, the value isn't really in the lazy automaton itself. The automaton is a tool. It's valuable because it gives us this perfect, clean laboratory to study one of the biggest mysteries in all of science: emergence.
By isolating the absolute simplest mechanism of change, these systems give us a crystal clear look at that dividing line between something that just stops and something that goes on forever. That's the core of emergence, and understanding it is the foundation for figuring out everything from how crystals grow to how galaxies form, all these giant complex systems that are governed by simple local rules.
And that just leaves us with this one final, fascinating thought to chew on. We've seen how a single lazy rule can be the seed for infinite complexity. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what seemingly complex systems in our own world, in physics, in biology, maybe even in society, might secretly be guided by a single, astonishingly simple, and maybe even lazy underlying rule?